So here's the thing. Here's the thing about branding. By design, it's emotional, and that's what makes it so powerful. It's not black and white. It's very subjective, but that's also what makes it tricky. So when you're moving from one brand to the next, and this means clients as well as employees of a company, moving from one brand to the next can be hard because it is emotional. But it's important to remember that that emotion is what makes the branding so powerful. And the other thing about branding is that its eye is always on the long term. Brands are meant to build businesses over time. And sometimes that's a challenge because our colleagues in the business tend to have much shorter goals. They have monthly target numbers they have to meet. There are quarterly earnings that have to be considered. So sometimes a long-term focus can seem to be at odds with a short-term focus. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And here's the thing about marketing. So, of course, everybody is an expert in marketing because everybody is marketed to. That's probably not news to you. But one thing that I have found over the years that has been really helpful to me is that there is rarely one perfect answer for any marketing challenge. Typically, there are a number of ways to approach a marketing challenge that will yield equally successful results. And sometimes I think we get paralyzed by waiting to find that one perfect campaign, that one perfect answer to the challenge we have. And maybe we don't need to. There's plenty of things out there that will get the same results. And here's the thing about this webinar. I don't have all the answers. I'm going to say some things, share some ideas. You may agree with them. You may disagree with them. They may be helpful, or they may inspire you to think about things a different way. I hope you have fun either way, and that's the thing about this webinar. Okay, so brand governance. There is a foundation that has to be set with brand governance, and let's jump right into it. The first is a brand strategy. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about a brand strategy now because my assumption is that everybody on this call has a brand strategy. However, I will spend a little time reminding what commitment it needs. You have to let your brand strategy guide all of your decisions, guide all of your work, verbally, visually, guide how you work with each other, how you work with your clients, how you work with your colleagues. A brand strategy requires commitment. Enemy number one of a strong brand is inconsistency, and the brand strategy should provide that for you. A couple of weeks ago on my website, I did a blog post about the new Starbucks Race Together initiative. And that, to me, was a perfect example of a brand committed to its strategy and seeing it through. Whether you liked it or hated the initiative, whether you think it's brilliant or stupid, you've got to admit that that is a company that is committed to its brand strategy. And the other thing, and this is really important, brand belongs to everyone. Sometimes in-house agencies and marketers, they're perceived as the ones that have the only responsibility for the brand. And that's just not true. And it's up to us, it's incumbent upon us to make certain that everyone understands that whether you come in contact with a customer once a day, once a month, once a year, never at all, everyone who works at a particular company is responsible for the brand. Leadership is extremely important. It's crucial. If you don't have strong senior leadership, you're going to have to work much harder than you need to. You need to have someone in a position of authority, ideally your CEO, pointing a sign directly at the brand strategy and say, that is the only way we do things around here. I once had a CEO who called himself the Chief Branding Officer, and that was awesome because it gave all of us a lot of credibility. So leadership is crucial. Middle management is important too, and this goes back to that first quote I shared, that middle managers, sometimes they just don't get it because, again, they're focused on the short term. It's very important that middle management get behind it and demonstrate some real leadership behind the brand as well. And that's only going to happen if you sell it. You've got to sell the brand. You've got to sell why brand in general is important, why the brand strategy you have is important, and how it will provide you and your internal clients with a competitive and relevant differentiation from their competitors. You've got to sell the power of the brand and the power of doing things right. And look outside the agency. There are a lot of people outside of in-house agencies who get it, who understand the challenges that we face, that want to do things the right way. Look for them and get them on your side. Okay, guidelines. Obviously, guidelines are crucial. The more thought out they are, the more specific they are, the more cohesive the work is going to be. And the faster it will get done. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But guidelines are also important, and they need to evolve. And when you're updating guidelines, it's important to look far and wide for places where a brand decision may someday be needed. I know that sounds painful. I know that sounds like a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but I've seen thousands and thousands of dollars wasted because someone has made an assumption about a part of the business that the brand guidelines did not fit well. So you've got to reach far and wide to make certain everything's understood. And the other thing about guidelines that I want to talk about is this concept I call off versus off. Guidelines can only go so far. They're like machines which lack a capacity for judgment and reason. And brand expression, as we talked about, is complicated. It's nuanced. It's emotional. It's subjective. There are going to be times when you may have to think beyond the brand guidelines and think about the brand itself. Once in a while, you may be faced with a situation in which something is technically off guide, meaning it violates some rule within your guidelines, but it really does support the brand. It really is on brand. This doesn't happen a lot, but it's really important to think about. And I'll give you a very simple, crude example that everybody can understand. Every company obviously has a primary color. And every company loves T-shirts. But you know what? Thread does not come in PMS colors. And so you pick the color that works best. And technically, that color is off guide, but it's on brand. And sometimes the colors just don't translate to cotton at all, and you have to go completely different. But the point is, you have to think about what is the end result for the brand, not what is the end result for the guidelines. Okay, words matter. This one might be a little controversial, and I might raise a few eyebrows, and apologize in advance if that's the case. But I think words really matter. And I've always had an issue with the word client. Again, I know this is a dicey topic, and the word client and the vocabulary is well ingrained in many organizations, and that's fine. My point is that it sometimes sets up a dynamic that is inefficient, that is counter to what we want to accomplish, because there's this idea that the customer's always right. Well, no, the customer's not always right, particularly when it's someone from an in-house agency trying to help one of their clients or a colleague. I use the word colleague far more than I use clients, because it's important for them to remember that we're in it for the long haul, that we are directly tied to their success. And so by working with and calling and thinking about our clients, so to speak, as colleagues, that can really have a big impact on how we go about working with them, on how we go about talking to them about branding, about how we go about doing things the right way. And another phrase that used to drive me nuts, especially if it was delivered with a little bit of an attitude, and you know exactly what I mean, brand compliant. Well, we can't do that because it's not brand compliant. That's not the point. The point is brand guidelines and brands have been set up to build the brand. It's not about compliance. It's about building. Something is either brand building or it's not. It's not about the compliance. It's a lot harder for someone to say, I don't care about building the brand. It's very easy for someone to say, I don't care about your compliance issues. So think about the end goal. It's about a brand building. And I also, even though the title of this session is Good Cop, Brand Cop, which I think is cute, and maybe that helped get you here. And if that's the case, great, glad you're here. But I actually don't even like the term brand police, because that doesn't have the inclusivity that it should have. Again, going back to the idea that the brand belongs to everyone. So if there's this idea of a group of people who are the brand police, well, that means that not everybody is responsible for the brand. Just a thought that words matter, and think about how we talk to one another and how we talk to our colleagues or clients. The next is find a balance. When you are faced with someone who is challenging the way to do something, with someone who wants to do something off-brand, who wants to do something the wrong way, listen. Just sit there and listen, and then listen some more. And I know that sounds painful, but the goal should be trying to understand before the goal is trying to be understood. Because once that person is through talking about why they want to do something, you'll have much more ability to focus them on a common goal and then convince them why the right way to do things is consistent with what they really want. And, admit it's not easy. As I've said already like 1,000 times, branding is complicated. It's nuanced. It's emotional. It's subjective. It's not easy to bring it all together and make it work day in and day out in a business. So just admit that and get them on your side. And the other thing is you got to pick your battles. Not everything is worth fighting for, and it's surprising that I say that. Some people find it surprising I say that, but there are the things that have the most potential to confuse the market, to set up a dangerous precedent, to be noticed. Those things are the ones you need to fight for, especially the element about setting a precedent. But there are some things that it's just not worth the effort. A little PowerPoint here or there that no one else, that probably no one will see, let alone anyone. Yeah, that's important. And I'll probably contradict myself in a minute, but just think about it. But when you do make an exception for a rule, make sure you give a reason why, because that way you won't have to be put in that situation again. Come up with a reason that is unique to the situation so that you don't have to do it again. Okay, so to me that was a foundation of a good brand governance program. But here are some of the things that I've learned along the way that I hope will be helpful. Without a doubt, the most striking lesson I learned from launching a global brand was the power of brand training. It is crucial. When we took the time to explain to someone why anything, why the color palette, why the logo looked the way it did, why we use these words, why all that, when we answered the question why, they were far more likely to get on board. It made sense to them, and so they were willing to do it the right way. Think too about how you train and what you train relative to what a person's role is. So obviously, graphic designers need a specific type of training, and copywriters need a specific type of training. But look outside the organization. Sales, that's a perfect example. I once did a verbal identity session for sales managers in the financial services business, and I braced myself to be laughed out of the room. But they lapped it up. They loved it because it gave them a way to connect their day-to-day job, their specific role, with the greater power of the brand. Admins. Think about admins. And this goes back to the whole dollar bill example that I started with. If you give admins a certain level of brand understanding, they're going to be able to cut off a whole lot of crazy because they're the first line of defense. So if you can think of a way to train your admins throughout your organization about the basics of the brand, it's going to make things a lot better. And find the right channel. And this will depend on your organization, its size, its culture. You may already have learning management systems in place that you can just feed the content into. But think about how you do it. Train the trainer, or weekly lunch and learns, or self-paced training, or whatever you have the budget for, or whatever you can do. Find the right channel. And then think about certification. You might want to think about how you can give credit to people the farther along they go in their understanding of the branding. That could be useful in, motivation, career planning, career development. It could also tap into people's competitive natures. Oh, look how far I got. Look at all the badges I have. But it can also be very important when and if you think about how you distribute the approval process within your brand. And this goes back to the picking your battles in some regard, but the highest visibility things, the ones that have the greatest impact on the business in the long term, those need to be made at the highest levels of the organization. Your CEO, if not your CMO or your CEO, sometimes there are things the CEO needs to get involved in. But the vast majority of decisions don't need the CEO's approval. And if they do, you've got some big problems. But at the base, there should be some things that a number of people can approve. So those are the lowest visibility. Those are the least potential to have a big impact or set a precedent. But if you're going to do this, consider roles like, say, a brand ambassador. Those can go a long way in helping people on a local level or on a very small, intimate level spread the gospel that is your brand, or get people to understand what the right way is. But if you do that, you have to offer them a lot of resources, not just the brand training we talked about. Robust resources like quick reference guides, or who to call in case they get in over their head. And of course, template as much of that lower stuff as you can. As much as you can template down below, that is the better. So that's just something to think about, distributing approval. This one's really important. Get on the same page. It's crucial that everybody in your agency understands the brand strategy in the same way, thinks about how it is executed in the same way, uses the same language. If you're going out across your organization and defending a change in the brand guidelines, or even just making a case for doing something one particular way, so powerful if everybody is using the same language. Because language is contagious, and we'll talk more about that in a second as well. And then recruit allies again. There are people out there that want to do things the right way, but make certain they're in agreement with you as well. Make certain that they're using the same language that you are using about any particular topic. So get on the same page. Recognize. This one's really important. You've got to make a spectacle of on-brand marketing wins. We at Thomson Reuters, right after the merger and right after the brand launch, we had a flagship, a madly successful product that did released a new version, and not everybody was on board the new brand because not everybody knew it was going to succeed. We knew it would succeed, but not everybody did. So this large flagship product decides to go forward with the new brand, and it was a mad success. Mad success. And after that, people were tripping over themselves to become brand building. Not brand compliant, brand building. We almost couldn't handle it. They were just tripping over themselves to learn more about the brand, to get the resources, to sign up for the intranet, all those different things. Identify brand champions within the organization. So these people that I talked about earlier that are out there that really get it and really want to do things the right way, that may not be part of the agency, recognize them. Do features on them or something. Give them credit. Award them. Come up with an award program. And then case study as much as you can. I know that the cobbler's children rarely have shoes, but you've got to market your marketing. You've got to do as many case studies as you can to get people on board, to give them that respect for the brand, that reverence for the brand, that will make your jobs in the long run all that much easier. Okay, so that is my thoughts on how you make it work. Here are just a few tricks I've learned over the years. This one's my favorite. Like the big boys do. So when faced with someone who is really putting up a fight about doing things the right way, who doesn't really see the need, doesn't really understand that being on brand is in everyone's best interest, it has to happen, I encourage you to ask them a question. Say, all right, so what are your favorite global brands? What are the brands that you really respect and admire? And you're going to get Apple and Coke and Nike and BMW and, the usual suspects. Then ask them, okay, well, could you imagine Apple approaching this situation the way you would like to approach it? In fact, If you put money in a vending machine and a can of Diet Coke came out with a bitmappy, scrunched up logo with a color that wasn't quite right, would you drink it? No, you probably wouldn't. So why would we want our customers to? Why would we hold ourselves to a standard that's any different than the successful brands that are already out there? Works more often than not. So like the big boys do. And then, I alluded to this earlier, there's no such thing as for internal use only. There's no such thing. So this is particularly true with language, because acronyms kill brands, or they maybe not kill brands, but they at least maim them a little bit. Think about all of the language that you use personally on a daily basis that you picked up from your significant other, a colleague, a family member, popular culture. Language is contagious. We steal language from one another without even realizing it, and that's why acronyms and certain phrases that are used internally always get out, and they confuse the market. They muddy the value of the brand. And visually, the same is true. We've all seen these ridiculously awful PowerPoints, but it's just for internal use only. No one's else going to see it. Well, A, no, it's not just for internal use only, because it will get outside. And B, why would we treat ourselves with less respect than we treat our customers? The brand has to be represented with respect and reverence everywhere, because there's no such thing as internal use only. Okay, this one's a good one. So most companies have, or think they have, client centricity. Most of them boast that they are very focused on their customers. Some are not. But most all of them boast. So if that's the case, when you're faced with an off-brand scenario, just bring up the customer. If the customer is king, then this is what is in their best interest. This will confuse the customer if we do it the wrong way. If it is off-brand, this will make it harder for the customer to really understand us, to connect with us. This will be inconsistent with what they're used to seeing. It's not in the customer's best interest. So that's an argument that goes a long way sometimes. Time is money. We alluded to this earlier as well. So guidelines save time because there's less back and forth. There's less debate about doing something this way or that way, or it takes so many decisions, so many arguments, so many debates off the table if you just agree to do things on brand that has been decided. And the great thing about that is not only does it save time, which is money, it also creates a more challenging and rewarding creative problem. Finding the ways to get a specific message across without having to worry about the minutia or the mechanics. So time is money. And similarly, another trick I learned along the way is you can talk about pain now or pain later. So when you stop to think about the role a brand plays, it's long-term, as we talked about. A strong brand will make the sales cycle much smaller, will make it go much faster. People will take your salespeople's calls more frequently. People will not take as long to make a decision. They won't need to bring as many people into the process if your brand is strong. And your customers, keeping your customers, will be a lot easier once your brand is really strong. Okay? Anything you do in the short term to delay that day, delay the day where you have a brand, excuse me, where you have a brand that does all the heavy lifting, every time you delay that, you're just delaying it for later. You're going to pay later or pay now. So it's just really important to think about long-term, how is your brand going to help you? And how can you, in the short term, mesh those goals, the day-to-day goals that we're all faced with, and our colleagues are faced with, numbers and earnings and things like that, with the long term. I mean, it's doable, obviously, but you've got to get people to think about it in terms of short-term and long-term. So those, my friends, are the thoughts I have. I am very happy to be here again, and I am very happy to answer whatever questions might be out there. Emily, what do you think? We have any questions?
Great, Douglas. Thank you. Yeah, we do have some questions streaming in here. I'm going to start reading them. As a reminder for folks who might have missed my spiel at the beginning, if you have any questions, you will have a little questions box on your toolbar from GoToWebinar, and you can type those in there, and I will read them over to Douglas. We have plenty of time, so please don't be shy and raise your hand if you have any questions. Our first question here, Douglas, we have changed our brand recently, and there's tons of older signage out there. However, funding for changing these comes from individual departments, not a brand fund. So how do you get people to voluntarily comply with new branding if there are no repercussions for not complying?
That's a good question, and one that is very common. I once had to, we bought a business in India, and I once had to explain to the former CEO of this business why he could no longer have his sign on his building, because he just didn't understand. And I wanted to say, well, you cash the check. So that's one reason. But this goes back to the leadership issue. In one respect, you've got to have leadership that gets behind this, and you've got to, when you do brand changes, when you migrate from one brand to the next or make a new change, you've got to plan for that money. Obviously, that doesn't help you now. But I think it goes back to helping them understand the long term. So the longer you keep, goes back to what I just said, the longer you keep that old signage up, the longer the customers are going to be confused. The more opportunity we give our competitors to come in and take them away. So you've got to find the money to do it. And then think of creative ways that they can do it, even if it's just temporary stuff. But you just have to make the case about why it's important. And if you can't do it, if you can't get them to do it, then think of a workaround. Try to find another customer touch point that you can influence that will reinforce the new visual identity, that will reinforce what you're trying to accomplish with it. So reason with them, try to get your senior leadership on board, find somebody that will, again, agree with you and work with you, but that would be the advice I would give off the bat.
Great, thank you, Douglas. Our next question is just IHAF related. There will be a recording of this presentation online following the session. I'll send it to all of the attendees as well, so you'll be able to access it for those of you who are curious and wondering. Now, our next question for you, Douglas, is we have several outside design agencies creating collateral for our department in addition to what we create in-house. Do you have any suggestions for coordinating style decisions between all of these groups?
Yeah, brand training, it goes back to that. You can create a brand training session specifically for outside agencies, and really look at your guidelines and give them limit the leeway they may have with the guidelines. So make certain they're all following the same playbook, the same way. If your guidelines are well written and if they're focused and if your brand strategy and how it comes to life is well articulated, you should be able to get them focused. And I would encourage you to have specific brand training for them and maybe even consider certification. If you compete with outside agencies, a lot of time you can work with your procurement folks and at least get a preferred list of vendors whom you know have been trained on the brand and who understand the brand. So I would just say brand training and reinforce the guidelines and how outside agencies are to interpret them.
Great. Our next question here, it's actually two questions in one. I'll read them both if you need me to read the second one again. I will. What types of materials template well, and where do you draw the line on flexibility versus compliance?
Okay. What kind of things template well? Well, print. Most everything in print is very templatable. However, obviously, I know that most companies are using less and less print every day. So anything that's print, that's pretty easy. I think things that have a lot of repetition, things that repeat more than change. So if you have, for example, if you have franchisees and you provide them with ads and only the dates and the dates and the address change, well, that's a perfect thing to template. So if you have anything that the bulk of the information doesn't change and it just needs a little bit, that's the things that you can template really easily. And Emily, I'm sorry, the second one was about when to say when, right?
Yep, when do you draw the line on flexibility versus compliance?
Again, I think it goes back to these two things I talked about. One is off versus off. Is it off brand? Is this detour from the brand or the guidelines? Is it off brand or is it just off guide? And then visibility. So think of a continuum. The more visibility it has and the more potential it has to set a precedent, the more stringent and the more strict you have to be with it. So think about it in a continuum. What's the worst that could happen? That's a question you have to ask when you're deciding whether to let something go or not.
All right, our next question here. Douglas, do you recommend setting up a brand clearinghouse that everything must pass through for approval, or is that a case of be careful what you ask for?
Absolutely. Careful what you ask for. We once had this beautiful color printer outside my office, and I was working late one night, and only my team was able to use it. And the sales guy comes up to me and he says, "Oh, I got this proposal due tomorrow morning. Can you run it through the color printer?" And I said, "Do you want me to see it?" And he said, "You know what? Black and white's fine." So you do have to be careful what you ask for, because you could get a lot. And I think that question, though, basically goes back to the size of the organization. The last thing you want is for brand to be perceived as a bottleneck. Because if the brand clearinghouse, if it can't handle what you're doing, then brand's going to become the enemy. So if you're going to set up a clearinghouse, which in a real world scenario is great, then you've got to make certain that you can handle the capacity, that you can streamline it, that it will work easily. If you can't do that, if you can't commit to a brand clearinghouse that will be efficient and effective, then you do have to think about distributing approval powers outside the organization.
All right, our next question here. How do you get other business units to adhere to your brand when they are more focused on achieving their financial goals than to the brand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that goes back to the brand strategy a lot. Are you a house of brands? Are you a branded house? And I think, and I hate to say this, actually goes back to leadership too. And this is a perfect example of where folks like us have to work harder than we need to if there's not sufficient leadership. I think it goes back to, that's exactly the situation we had when I talked about the flagship that decided to go with a new brand. You've got to demonstrate success. You've got to demonstrate success, and you've got to make it clear that they're going to be the outliers, and that will not look good to the board or senior management, or whomever is important to them. But you've got to showcase success. You've got to demonstrate to them why they need to change. And I think there's also that emotional element too that I talked about. I think sometimes business units are hesitant to change, not because they can't afford it, not because they don't have time, because they don't want to, because they like the way things are. They're connected with the way things are. So if you're going to ask someone to change, if you're going to ask someone to move to something different, you have to give them an equally powerful emotional reason why. So why is this better? Why will they love having it? Why is this the time to do it? So you've got to think about it, and I tell this when I talk to people about migrating products, or if you acquire a brand, when do you take an acquired brand and bring it into the new identity? You've got to think about their journey. Where are they in their emotional journey or their fiscal journey, and how do you get them? What can you do to get them closer and closer and closer to the end of the journey, which is being completely on brand?
Great. Our next question here, looking for some advice. Our internal department name is different than our external facing brand name, and it sometimes tends to confuse people. Do you have any advice to offer them?
I think you need to do a rebranding. You've got to get it consistent. It's hard to. That's a question that's hard to answer in a vacuum, and I'm happy to talk one-on-one with whoever asks that later. But based on the skeleton of the question, you've got to get consistency, because you can't create a consistent brand if you can't be consistent yourself.
Great. Our next question. We have visual identity guidelines, but no brand guidelines. What can we do?
Ooh, That's bad. The guidelines were ideally created based on something, I would imagine. So you've got to go back and find out what was behind the selection or the decisions that were made about the visual guidelines, and then really get your senior management to think carefully about who they are as a brand and what they want, how they want to bring that to life. That's an issue that you've got to drive up to the top of that pyramid. It's got to be a very senior decision that's made. But in the absence of that, find out how you got where you are, and then leverage that, and then celebrate that, and make that your brand in the absence of a approved and bona fide brand strategy.
Great, Douglas. Well, that looks like it's it for questions that came in this afternoon. As you can all see on the screen, we have Douglas's contact information. So if you do want to reach out to him as a one-off, please feel free to do so. Don't be shy. Thanks again, Douglas, for spending your time with us today. It was a great session, and thanks for all our attendees for joining us this afternoon, taking your time out of your afternoon to